I told myself it would be fine. I told myself that on the 40-minute drive to my in-laws' house, watching the highway flatten out into the kind of wide-open Texas, nothing that always made me feel small. I told myself again when I lifted my daughter out of her car seat and she looked up at me with those big brown eyes that trusted everything. And I told myself one more time when we walked through the front door of that house and stepped into the smell of pot roast and old carpet and a celebration that had been planned without us in mind. My niece's birthday party, 12 kidsids, streamers in pink and gold, a 3-tiered cake with hand-painted roses that I know cost more than my weekly grocery budget. My sister-in-law had been planning it for 2 months. I knew because she talked about it at every family dinner, every Sunday call, every group text that pinged my phone at odd hours. The custom banner, the photographer, the favor bags with personalized tags. My daughter Ren had turned 7 3 weeks earlier. We celebrated at home. Cake from the grocery store bakery, her favorite, yellow with chocolate frosting. I'd bought her a telescope because she'd been obsessed with planets ever since her kindergarten teacher did a unit on the solar system. We ate pizza and watched a movie, and she fell asleep in my lap on the couch, with a frosting smear still on her chin. I didn't think anything of it at the time. My niece's birthday was coming up, and I understood the family energy was pointed that direction. I didn't expect the same 3-tier cake. I didn't expect a photographer. I just didn't expect nothing. The party started at 2. By 2:30, the living room was buried in gifts, the kind of pile that seems physically impossible until you're standing in front of it. Towers of wrapped boxes and gift bags with curling ribbon, things that beeped and sang and lit up, a child-sized vanity with a mirror that lit from behind, a new bike parked by the fireplace with a giant pink bow. My mother-in-law stood in the center of it all like she'd choreographed every second, pressing her cheek to my niece's cheek for photos, directing the unwrapping sequence, lifting the good gifts toward the light so my sister-in-law's husband could capture them on video. Ren sat next to me on the floor near the back of the room. She'd worn her favorite dress, the navy one with small white stars. She'd asked me that morning if she thought her cousin would like the birthday card she made. She'd spent 45 minutes on it, cutting out little paper moons and gluing them around the edges. For a while she watched the unwrapping with the focused attention of a kid who loves her cousin and loves parties and genuinely, fully expected to be part of the joy in the room. Every time a new gift came out, she leaned forward just slightly, not reaching, just watching, hoping, maybe, to be included in the wonder of it. At some point she quietly climbed into my lap. She didn't say anything. She put her back to my chest and kept watching. I felt her ghost stills in that specific way that isn't peace, the stillness of a child absorbing something she doesn't have the words for yet. After the cake was cut and the sugar rush started and the kids scattered through the house, my mother-in-law came over to where we were sitting. She ruffled Ren's hair and said, "You having fun, sweetie?" and moved on before Ren had finished nodding. I looked around the room. My sister-in-law's 3 kids were orbiting their gifts, already negotiating who got to play with what first. Ren sat beside me, turning the paper moon card she'd made in her hands, quiet as a stone. That was the moment. Not loud, not dramatic, just the 2 of us sitting in the wreckage of someone else's celebration, and my daughter looking down at the card she'd made for her cousin and saying very softly, "Did they forget my birthday too?" I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. Her birthday had been 3 weeks ago. We'd had cake and a telescope, and I'd told her the family would celebrate together soon. We'd been waiting for the right family gathering. I'd assumed it would happen naturally, the way it always had for my niece. The cake at Grandma's house, the fuss, the moment where everyone sang and she was the center. But there had been no phone call about Ren's birthday. No mention at dinner. No, we should do something special. Just this party, planned for 2 months, with a 3-tier cake and a photographer, and my daughter sitting quietly on the floor with a handmade card and a dress with little stars. I brushed her hair back. "No, baby, they didn't forget." She nodded like she believed me. I didn't believe me. I helped her into her jacket about 20 minutes later. She tucked the card into her own bag. She'd decided not to give it, though she didn't say why. When my mother-in-law asked where we were going, I said we had somewhere to be, which was a lie. We went to a diner 3 blocks from our house and ordered pancakes at 4 in the afternoon, and Ren ate her weight in maple syrup and eventually started telling me a long, wandering story about a dream she'd had where she discovered a new planet and named it after our cat. By the time we got home, she seemed lighter. I did not. I sat in the kitchen after she fell asleep and tried to think clearly. There was a part of me that wanted to call it an oversight. Families get busy. Birthdays fall through the cracks. Maybe no one had thought to coordinate. Maybe. But I knew my in-laws. I knew how much attention, money, and planning had gone into that party. I knew that my sister-in-law's youngest had gotten a grandmother-hosted birthday celebration every year since he was born. I knew that when my niece turned 5, my mother-in-law had hired a face painter. Wren had never had a birthday party at that house. Not once. She'd been given cards, sometimes, and the occasional gift that felt like an afterthought. A coloring book bought at a gas station, a stuffed animal with the tag still on from a drugstore. Once, when she was 4, my mother-in-law had given her a wrapped present that turned out to be something my niece had already outgrown. I hadn't said anything. I'd thanked her. Wren had been thrilled because it was wrapped. I'd been telling myself for years that the difference wasn't intentional, that geography played a role. My sister-in-law lived 10 minutes from my in-laws and we lived 40 minutes out. That my niece was simply older and had established more history with them. That it would even out. Sitting in my kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, I understood that it wasn't going to even out. That I'd been waiting for a correction that was never coming. I had bought Wren gifts before we went to the party. She didn't know. I'd wrapped them and tucked them on a high shelf in my closet, planning to give them to her that evening after the party as a little just because surprise. A set of planet-themed notebooks, a star projector for her room, a book about women astronomers. I gave them to her the next morning before school. She sat on the kitchen floor in her pajamas tearing through the paper with pure 7-year-old joy, and when she held up the star projector she whispered, "Can we use this tonight?" And I said yes, absolutely, and she carried it around the house for the rest of breakfast like a trophy. But watching her little face, lit up and proud, I felt something cracking open underneath the happiness. She deserved to feel this celebrated in that house. She deserved a cake and a song and her grandmother actually looking at her for longer than it takes to ruffle her hair. The fact that I had to create that privately, quietly, like a consolation prize, that was something I was no longer willing to keep accepting on her behalf. I didn't call my mother-in-law right away. I waited until I could think without my voice shaking. I called her 4 days later. I kept it calm, factual. I said that I'd noticed Wren's birthday hadn't been acknowledged at a family level, and I wanted to understand why, and whether it was something we could talk about. My mother-in-law went quiet for a second and then said, "Well, so we celebrated with her when she was there," which was not a thing that had happened. I said as much, gently. She said, "She always seems happy when she comes over." I said that children often seem happy because they're children, and that seeming fine and being treated fairly weren't the same thing. The conversation went in circles for about 15 minutes, and ended with her saying she was sorry I felt that way, which is not the same as being sorry for what she'd done. I hung up and sat with it for a while. Then I went to my desk. My husband's parents had always been listed as secondary beneficiaries on my life insurance policy, a holdover from when we first got married, and I was 26 and just filling out the paperwork without thinking too hard about it. I also had a small trust structure I'd set up when Wren was born, intended to ensure she'd be taken care of if something happened to me. My parents-in-law were named as trustees alongside my own parents, under the assumption that they were family who would act in her interest. I spent an hour on the phone with my financial planner, then I sent 2 emails to my attorney. By the end of the week the changes were filed. My in-laws removed from the insurance beneficiaries, my in-laws removed as trustees. My own mother and my college roommate, who is organized, patient, and genuinely loves Wren, named in their place. My husband's parents didn't know. My husband didn't know yet either. I needed to think about how to have that conversation. It turned out I didn't have to initiate it. My mother-in-law called 3 days later, which meant she had somehow sensed a shift, or someone had mentioned my phone call to my sister-in-law, who had probably filled in the rest. The call started as a check-in and escalated quickly. She said she thought I was being oversensitive. She said that Wren was loved and always welcome in her home. She said that different children needed different things, and that my niece happened to be at a stage where big parties were meaningful, and Wren was different. I asked what she meant by different. She said, "You know, she's more quiet." Ren is thoughtful. She listens before she speaks. She asks detailed questions about how black holes form and whether the moon remembers being part of the Earth. The idea that her internal life made her less deserving of a birthday cake at her grandmother's house was something I couldn't let stand without putting it on the table directly. I said, "I need you to hear this clearly. I don't think Ren's personality is the issue. I think the issue is that she has been treated as less important than her cousins her entire life, and I'm not willing to pretend I haven't noticed anymore." The line went quiet. Then my mother-in-law said, "I think you're going to regret making this into something it isn't." I said, "I think I would regret it more if I didn't." I hung up. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me. The next 2 weeks were a blur of text messages I didn't answer and one visit from my father-in-law that I was not expecting. He knocked on my door on a Wednesday afternoon while Ren was at school and my husband was at work. He stood on my porch holding a paper bag from a bakery downtown, and he looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, like the confrontation had cost him something too. He handed me the bag. Inside was a small decorated birthday cake, white frosting, purple flowers, "Happy Birthday, Ren," written in careful looping letters. I stood there for a long moment. "She picked the flowers herself," he said, "from the picture book at the bakery." She wanted purple. I knew he meant my mother-in-law. She had gone to the bakery and picked out the flowers. I tried to figure out what to do with that. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. He sat at my kitchen table and I made coffee, and we were quiet for a while. He wasn't a man who talked easily about feelings. He'd spent 40 years in a marriage where his job was to keep the peace and hers was to run the family, and he'd never really learned how to have a different conversation. Eventually, he said, "She doesn't always know how to show it the same way to all of them." I said, "I know. But Ren notices. She's 7, not 2. She's going to remember this." He looked at the table. "I know." He left after 1 cup of coffee. He didn't apologize exactly, but there was something in the way he looked at the cake before he left, checking the letters were still intact, making sure the box was closed right. That felt like the closest he knew how to get. I set the cake on the counter. When Ren came home from school, she spotted it immediately, dropped her backpack mid-stride, and walked straight to the kitchen with her eyes wide. She read the words on the cake and looked up at me. "Is that from Grandma?" "Yes," I said. She thought about this for a moment. "Did she pick the purple flowers?" "She did." She nodded slowly, opened the refrigerator, got out a juice box, stood there drinking it and looking at the cake with an expression I couldn't entirely decode. Not exactly warm, not exactly cold, just careful, like she was deciding something. After a moment she said, "Can we have some after dinner?" We did. It was good cake. She ate 2 slices and then went to her room to work on a drawing she'd been making of her imaginary planet. I sat at the table with the leftover frosting and thought about all the conversations I still needed to have, all the lines I still needed to draw, all the ways I had been quietly absorbing things for years and calling it keeping the peace. My husband and I talked that night, after Ren was asleep. I told him about the financial changes I'd made. He was quiet for a long time. I didn't fill the silence. Finally he said, "Why didn't you tell me first?" I said, "Because I needed to do something before I lost my nerve, and because I've been bringing this up for 4 years and it has never been taken seriously." Another silence. Then he said, "You're right that it's been a problem." That was more than I expected. I didn't cry, but it was close. We talked for 2 hours. It wasn't easy. There were things he said that landed badly, and things I said that I had to walk back and find a better way to say. But we got somewhere. We got to a place where we both agreed that Ren's birthday needed to be treated like a real event by his family, that the pattern we'd both been watching had to be named and addressed, that I had the right to make decisions about financial documents that affected our daughter's future. He called his mother the next day. I wasn't in the room for the call, but I heard his end of it. He was firmer than I expected. He said the word favoritism out loud, which was something I had never once heard him say. His mother cried, which she does when she doesn't get her way. He didn't relent. When he came back into the living room, he looked tired in a way that wasn't just the phone call. He looked like someone who had just seen the shape of something clearly for the first time. "I'm sorry it took me this long," he said. I nodded. That was enough for now. Things didn't transform overnight. They rarely do. My mother-in-law needed time to move through her own version of events before she could look at mine. My sister-in-law was briefly furious with me in a way that arrived as several long text messages I read once and chose not to engage with. My father-in-law started texting Ren directly. Small things, pictures of birds he saw in the yard, jokes he'd cut out of the newspaper. Ren loved it. She started sending him drawings of her imaginary planet. He always wrote back. In January, my mother-in-law called to ask what Ren might want for her next birthday. It was only February, not for another 11 months. It was the first time she had ever called to ask. I told her Ren was going through a phase of loving everything related to space. My mother-in-law said, "Oh, like rockets and things." I said, "More like stars, constellations." "How the universe was made," she said, and then, I didn't know that about her. The admission landed quietly between us. I didn't rub it in, I just said, "Now you do." Ren's 8th birthday came in late April. My mother-in-law hosted a small dinner, not a production with a photographer and a custom banner, but something real. A homemade lasagna, garlic bread from scratch, a cake she'd baked herself with a frosting design Ren had requested, which was a slightly imperfect but recognizable rendering of the solar system in blue and gold. She'd clearly spent real time on it. You could see the effort in the way the rings of Saturn were slightly lopsided, in the way she'd used yellow and white together to try to make the sun look right. Ren stood at the kitchen counter looking at that cake for a full minute before she said anything. Then she looked up at my mother-in-law and said, "Is that Jupiter?" "It has the stripe," my mother-in-law said. I watched 4 videos to get the stripe right. Ren's face opened completely, full, unguarded, all the way real. "You can have the first slice," Ren said, like she was bestowing an honor. Later that night, after we'd driven home and Ren had been tucked in and the house had settled into its quiet, I sat on the couch in the dark for a while. Not thinking, exactly, just sitting with it. The cake with the lopsided Saturn rings, the 4 videos, the sentence, "I didn't know that about her," and everything it contained. There was no moment where everything became fine. That's not how these things work. Years of hierarchy don't dissolve over a plate of lasagna. But there was a shift, and the shift had started because I'd refused to keep pretending. Because I'd stood in the wreckage of that birthday party with my daughter quiet in my lap, and decided I was done absorbing things on her behalf. Ren asked me once, a few months later, out of nowhere while she was eating cereal, "Did Grandma forget my other birthdays?" I thought about it carefully. "I think she wasn't paying close enough attention," I said. "But she's paying attention now." Ren turned her spoon over in her bowl. "Because you told her to?" I looked at her, 7 years old, headed toward 8, already understanding more than she was supposed to have to. "Because I stopped pretending it was okay when it wasn't," I said. She thought about that for a second. Then she said, "Good," and went back to her cereal, and that finally felt like enough.